President Trump announced Wednesday White House counsel Don McGahn will resign later this year. One person who was not expecting that announcement was Don McGahn. The president made the announcement in a tweet Wednesday morning. Mr. Trump said McGahn would leave after Judge Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court confirmation hearings. But CBS News has confirmed McGahn did not know the president would be announcing his departure. McGahn has been White House counsel since the president took office. Later in the day, the president praised McGahn's service.
Don McGahn's a really good guy. Been with me for a long time. Privately before this, he represented me. He's been here now. It'll be almost 2 years, and a lot of affection for Don. And he'll be moving on, probably the private sector, maybe the private sector, and he'll do very well. But he's done an excellent job.
Molly Hooper is a CBSN political contributor and congressional reporter for The Hill. She joins me now from Washington. All right, Molly, what has been the reaction on Capitol Hill to the announcement that McGahn is leaving the White House?
Well, this had been quietly in the works for a while. Don McGahn has been with the president since, oh my gosh, I remember running into Don McGahn at one of Trump's first rallies back in 2015 when he came up to Capitol Hill to do an event with then, Senator and presidential contender Ted Cruz. I mean, wow. Don was there. He's been with this campaign and with the president for a long time, and really his goal was to make it through Kavanaugh's confirmation and then to leave. Having given so much time to the president and whatnot, I think that, when the president happened to tweet out that was happening, that took him by surprise. But Don McGahn, and I've known him for a while, he's a pretty level-headed guy, and he takes things as it is. And I think that based on the reporting I've seen, his response was something like, "Oh well, what do you expect?"
Well, let's turn to Capitol Hill. September is a big month for Congress.
Yes.
Confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh begin next Tuesday. There's also a government funding deadline at the end of the month. What can we expect as lawmakers begin to take up these issues?
Well, Kavanaugh is going to start off next week. His hearings are on September 4th. Senator Grassley, Judiciary Committee Chairman, set that date, and those hearings will be taking place over about a 1 week period. I'd say probably 3 or 4 days. And we'll hear from Kavanaugh and then from people who support him and oppose him, and it'll just be a big brouhaha. But eventually, it looks like he's going to get through. It looks like he'll be confirmed. Now, the funding debate that's actually an interesting matter, and when the Republicans went into this season of spending bills, usually we run up to a deadline, and all of the government funding bills are wrapped into one. It's called an omnibus, and it's basically a make or break bill. And if you don't pass it, then the entire government shuts down. Well, that's not the way it's really supposed to work. It's supposed to work by the Senate and the House approved 12 individual separate bills dealing with various agencies so that those agencies are funded, right? And so thus far, the House has passed maybe 6 or 7, perhaps more, of the funding bills. The Senate just completed a number of the funding bills, which is a big deal for the Senate because usually these bills get tied up due to unrelated issues. But the Senate Republicans agreed to Democrats, we won't allow poison pill amendments. We'll just get these bills out. And so actually, they're making quite a bit of progress. And when the House and Senate get back next week, I believe there's a conference committee on the biggest bills, defense, the funding for our military, labor, HHS, so that's the health care stuff, and some other agencies, I believe State Department's in there as well, so that those bills will make it to the president's desk the way that they're supposed to, so that you don't get jammed up with one big comprehensive bill that's either make it or break it. So when there's this issue of, okay, the president says he's willing to shut down the government over the wall funding, well, that's the Homeland Security Department, and that funding has not been approved yet. However, if it comes to that point, that would be the only agency that perhaps doesn't have funding for a day or two, whatever it is, but the rest of the government would be funded.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different, yeah.
Yeah, no,
because they don't want to deal with this. They don't want to deal with this in their midterm elections.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I would imagine that is got to be looming very large right now for them.
Absolutely. And the thing about these funding bills, it's kind of interesting. When we hear votes on the House floor or the Senate floor having to do with abortion rights, climate change, immigration reform, things like that, usually members try to attach it to big pieces of spending legislation, like the funding bills, which is why a lot of times they get gummed up in the works in the Senate. And at the end of the day, it's easier to just pass an all-encompassing, comprehensive bill, one big package. But because the Republicans wanted to get this taken care of, they didn't want a government funding situation, they didn't want a government spending situation coming up, shutdown situation, excuse me. The Republicans agreed to say, listen, if somebody puts a poison pill amendment like Rand Paul did last week with the with an abortion funding amendment, the Republicans, most of them, would agree to table it so that it wasn't attached, even though they wouldn't necessarily agree with that personally. It was just in order to get these bills to the president's desk and avoid a government shutdown, they were willing to make that concession. It was that big of a deal.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they are well aware of the fact that voters blame them whenever there is a government shutdown. All right, let's turn to Jeff Sessions. Over the past few days, 5 different Justice Department officials have told CBS News they expect Attorney General Jeff Sessions to be fired. And we've also learned that Liberty University President Jerry Falwell Jr., a close confidant of the president, told Mr. Trump to fire Sessions on 2 occasions. I'm wondering what you're hearing, Molly, with respect to Jeff Sessions. I know, obviously, on Capitol Hill, there are a lot of people who I'm sure talk about this. First of all, how are lawmakers reacting to this prospect? It's something that I know has been discussed before, but also, are you hearing anything that maybe sounds a little bit different when it comes to Jeff Sessions?
Oh my God, this is such a story. It's such an interesting story because there's various facets to it. And it's not just the president wanting to fire Jeff Sessions because of political considerations, right? Because of the Russia, he has a problem. The president has a problem with Jeff Sessions because Jeff Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigation, and he's not in charge of it. And so Trump sends out these tweets saying that, I can't believe my attorney general recused himself. I wouldn't have hired him if he had told me he would do that. Okay, that's one aspect of it. And that kind of thing ticks off some Republicans like Ben Sasse, who went to the Senate floor earlier this week and essentially said that. I believe it was last week, and said, if the president fires Jeff Sessions because he is doing so for political reasons, because he doesn't think Jeff Sessions is carrying his weight, then I will vote against any future nominee for Attorney General that the president puts up. Right? Okay, so that's one. And keep in mind how closely divided the Senate is. And now with Don McGahn's loss, it's even more closely. It's pretty much a 50-50 Senate. So if the president loses a Republican on an attorney general nominee, he's lost that fight, right? Yeah. So you have this aspect, right? But there's also something else going on. And Lindsey Graham, who had previously stood up for Jeff Sessions, saying, I'd raise holy hell if the president fired Jeff Sessions. He's backtracked and he said perhaps it is time for new blood in the DOJ, and he alluded to some kind of breach that goes beyond this political issue that the president has with Jeff Sessions. So that makes you wonder, okay, what's going on here? And that's sort of what's confusing up on Capitol Hill, because on the one hand, you have Republicans like Mitch McConnell, who's known Jeff Sessions, basically telling him, don't quit. Don't leave this job. We still need you there because, again, who else are they going to get to fill those shoes? So it's a very precarious situation, and as long as Jeff Sessions decides to stay in that role and really makes the president fire him, well, it's unclear if the president will fire him, which is what I'm hearing from some Republicans who tell me the president doesn't like to actually fire people. Look at how he handled Rex Tillerson, former Secretary of State. He made John Kelly do it. And Jeff Sessions wants to hear it from the president. But again, you look at Lindsey Graham, who says there's a toxic relationship here, and Roy Blunt, who's also a senator from Missouri, Republican, who says, well, perhaps it's time for the Attorney General to move on. That's fine. However, who are they going to get to replace him? And that's the other question that Republicans are asking. Who would take over this position of Attorney General? And that's a question up on Capitol Hill.
That's a big question.
Among others.
Right. Well, I know you're in Washington, obviously, Molly, but I do want to get your thoughts on the Florida gubernatorial race. Republican nominee Ron DeSantis is facing criticism for remarks he made about Democratic nominee Andrew Gillum during an interview Wednesday morning. Let's listen to what he said.
We've got to work hard to make sure that we continue Florida going in a good direction. Let's build off the success we've had on Governor Scott. The last thing we need to do is to monkey this up by trying to embrace a socialist agenda.
So DeSantis's campaign, Molly, said he was just referring to Gilham's agenda. Gillham responded later in the day in an interview with CBS News correspondent Manuel Bojorquez. Let's listen.
If Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump want to continue to work to divide, to separate us based off of what color our skin is, what language we may speak, what religion we may hold, I believe that the citizens and the residents of this state are going to send a very convincing message on November 6th. We'll leave the divisive tactics and divisive rhetoric to Donald Trump and soon-to-be former Congressman DeSantis when we take over as the next governor of the state of Florida.
All right, so Molly, you have borne witness to a lot of political fights covering Capitol Hill. So I'm just curious, what is your take on what we're seeing here? I mean, obviously, this is going to be a very closely watched race.
Oh my gosh, for so many reasons. Keep in mind, this is Donald Trump's candidate versus essentially Bernie Sanders' candidate. So, I mean, there's so many reasons that people are going to have their political eyes on Florida. Also in the midst of hurricane season, right. But the political hurricane that's going on. But in terms of the comment about, you know, monkeying that up, well, just ask Joe Biden. I mean, look at what happened when Joe Biden called then candidate Barack Obama articulate.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's hard. You know, I do talk to congressmen on Capitol Hill, Democrats and Republicans, and not very many are around these days. They're back home in their districts. But when similar issues like this have come up in the past, you know, they say sometimes it's tough. You know, you'll say something and you won't necessarily mean it to a certain way, and it may come out the wrong way or maybe misconstrued, and it's just unfortunate. You know, an unfortunate way to say something. But you know, what's the intent behind it? And I've covered Ron DeSantis, and he seems like a pretty straight shooter. You know, it's unclear how this will affect the race going forward, and how it will affect, you know, other races perhaps across the country. But I think that it is a reminder to Republicans and Democrats, you know, you have to be really careful about your choice of words and how they may impact others. And especially given the situation in which we find ourselves, and this is something that I hear from both parties and both sides of the aisle, that people are really mad out there. There's, you know, this is a very polarized country, and again, it's not necessarily being politically correct. It's just you got to watch your words and be aware of what you're saying and how you're saying something.
Yeah, well, no doubt we'll probably be hearing more about this in the days and weeks ahead. Molly Hooper, thank you so much, Molly. Always great to have you on.
Thank you.